Welcome to the Fleet Geeks podcast. We're here to help develop fleet and transport professionals. Do you want to progress and develop your skills and knowledge? We promise to bring lively conversation and debate around interesting issues and keep you bang up to date with changes in our awesome industry. The Fleet Geeks are a community of professionals, and if you enjoy the podcast, why not join the discussion for free in the Fleet Geek community over on Facebook. Hello and welcome to the third in this series of podcasts with Lisa Dorn. Lisa has kindly joined me on two previous podcasts talking about workload and also talking about skills fade as well. And here we are on the final and third podcast to talk about I've had a mind blank for a moment. I got distracted, and we're going to be talking about distraction, particularly in the context of driving as well. So Lisa, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast again. Thank you very much. Are you able, just for the listeners, if they've not listened to the previous two, hopefully they're going to go back and listen to those, but if they're listening to this for the first time, just give a quick introduction if that's okay, Lisa.
Sure. So my title is Associate Professor of Driver Behaviour at Cranfield University, and I've been working in the field of driver behaviour for over 30 years, widely published on the topic, and I also have founded the company SciDrive to make my research more available to the general public.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lisa. And with those credentials, I massively have my imposter syndrome bouncing up and down. Okay, so I really appreciate you taking the time out to have a chat with me. Now, I mentioned in the first podcast that Lisa and I met each other at the Chartered Institute for Logistics and Transport Safety Forum's 10th anniversary, and that was the annual meeting or annual conference, sorry. And Lisa was there, and she was talking about this exact subject. And I remember on her slides, my attention was caught by the neuroanatomy slide. So this is a little bit techie potentially for some or scientific potentially for some of the listeners, but Lisa did an amazing job of explaining frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and I'm not even going to pronounce them correctly, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to hand back over to you, Lisa, to just have a bit of a run through the sort of a bit about how our brain works, and then how that can lead to, we'll start talking about distraction following that. But yeah, how does our brain work, Lisa?
Well,
how long do we have? Sorry.
That is quite a starter for 10. The brain is incredibly complex, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of what are the important aspects of the brain. All aspects of the brain are important, but particularly relevant for distraction, because what we primarily use when we're driving are the kind of clever parts of the brain, if you like, and that's called the frontal lobe. And that's the part of the cortex. It's at the front of the brain where all the decision making goes, if you like. It's a very dense area that acts very fast on information that it's selected for attention, and it is able to inhibit other responses. It's able to control its impulses, and it's a real focus of attention. It's where, if you imagine with driving, it's a primarily visual task, and therefore we need that frontal lobe to really focus our attention and select appropriate information from the environment to be able to make good decisions.
Fantastic. And so that is potentially, just based on some of the understanding that I have, that can potentially be in conflict, for example, with other parts of the brain, particularly if we're emotional, distracted, and those kinds of things. So what is the temporal lobe? What does that part do? It's sort of a bit below and behind the frontal lobe.
Okay, so the temporal lobe primarily, although it has lots of other functions, but it primarily processes emotions.
Okay.
And as part of the temporal lobe, we have two kidney bean type structures called the amygdala, and they're kind of located kind of just above the ear, either side of the head. And essentially those are our emotional computers. And what happens here is that whenever we have an emotional kind of experience, the amygdala is responsible for processing that information. Now, what can happen when you're driving is that when you're feeling stressed, then the emotions essentially are being processed by the brain, which means that there's less spare capacity to be sending that information that you need to be aware of to the frontal lobe for decision making. In a sense, it's kind of bypassing the clever part of the brain. It's going to another part of the brain, which is kind of evaluating whether there's a threat here, whether, you know, you need to go into survival mode. It's a kind of fight or flight type response that you might need. And that's where distraction can be particularly problematic when people are stressed, because not only is it that the brain is processing this emotion, but also it's also speeding up, because when people are stressed, the kind of operating speed, if you like, of the brain is much higher, and that also can be a source of distraction.
Fantastic. So I've got to curb my enthusiasm to go down this like emotional and road rage and all of that sort of stuff, because we're going to focus on distraction. So I'm not going to go down the road rage point of view, but all we're saying here is there's a clear thing here that we need to stay relaxed when we're driving, right? Otherwise, it's going to massively inhibit the cognitive skills that we talked about in our last podcast. It's going to inhibit those because essentially the brain can't do both. Is that?
It can do both, but something will drop.
Okay.
And the fear is that when people are stressed, and we know that they're much more likely to be involved in a crash when people are stressed, when they're under time pressure, you know, when they have perhaps something going on in their lives that's, you know, is affecting their cognitive processing abilities, like, you know, perhaps they've got financial pressures, perhaps, you know, they've got loved ones that are poorly or that they have responsibilities for. You know, there's a number of different life stress problems that a driver can be going through at any one time. So it's not just the stress of the job, if you like, it can also be what's going on in their personal lives. And the two aspects can actually make things even worse.
Fantastic. So that's really interesting, because certainly for the audience who are listening, that is us almost giving them scientific explanation why it's important that they take care of their drivers and they take time to listen to and know them. Because historically in our industry, there's always been a bit of a sort of put up, shut up, we don't talk about these kinds of things, which is changing. There is a bit of a shift that's going on, but there'll be fleet and transport managers out there who don't feel comfortable talking about these things with people. But actually, if they've got drivers, it's really important that they start to understand if there are some sort of external challenges that they're facing, because it is going to impact their ability to their driving and their ability to drive. Is that a fair assessment,
yes.
Lisa?
Yes, it is. And you know, it doesn't need to be an invasive kind of intrusive, you know, asking every driver every day if they're okay. You know, there are assessments that are available. You know, certainly through SideDrive, that's also something that can be set up to look at, you know, what are the critical life events that a driver is going through. It can be all done, you know, online, and something that you could be perhaps doing every 6 months or something. It's a quick checklist, and just a driver feeling that someone cares and is looking out for them is sufficient for the sense of sort of social support that's out there that can make them feel, you know, cared about in the workplace. And whilst you can't do anything necessarily about some of the problems that they're encountering, you know, lending a supportive environment at work is really going to be beneficial.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because actually drivers do tend, particularly in the haulage industry, due to the long hours at the, long hours of operation, and drivers are spending a long time on their own, and that can lead to feelings of isolation and those kind of emotional responses, which I suppose are really a conflict with good standards of driving. So it's interesting, because I thought we were going to go down the route of mobile phones, which we're going to in a moment. But I'm really interested in. So I'm really interested in this, and that, and I think my point is, or I think what I'm worried about is naturally there'll be this observable reduction in use of the frontal lobe as drivers are driving for longer periods of time, which I guess leads into like the workload that we were talking about before. But ultimately, just for a moment, I'm just wanting to raise the point, I suppose, that essentially naturally the driving standards are going to reduce, because the frontal lobe is going to over time start to get distracted. Is that it can only focus for a certain amount of time? Is that, am I sort of following the right path here, Lisa?
Yes. Well, the frontal lobe, when you're driving, especially if you're driving in a high workload situation, there are going to be kind of demands on the brain that means that you shouldn't really be driving for extended periods of time, because it will increase people's levels of fatigue and stress and so on. So, taking a regular break and these kind of things does definitely help. We're into the realm of sustained attention here, where the sort of idea of vigilance and being able to constantly monitor, and going back to the idea of being in an isolated environment when you're perhaps driving for work in a monotonous environment, in a truck, and work, perhaps driving in the dark. This is a kind of an environment which can be very difficult to sustain your attention over a period of time.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna move on, because I'm conscious that we're moving into the previous conversations we've had, which we're sort of teetering on, and I want to make sure that we've sort of covered a broad range of the different topic areas. So I'm really conscious with distraction. I wanted to have a talk about in-cab distractions, because I know that's a big focus area for the audience who listen. So obviously it's illegal for people to use a mobile phone, and many fleet managers will use that, and they will. And the challenge is sometimes with drivers, I think, is it's explaining why is it illegal, and them understanding that. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity here for fleet managers and the people listening to be able to understand the science behind why that is, because we naturally know that it's going to, we're focusing on something else, so it's not gonna, we're not going to be able to multitask in the way that we believe we can, because I think many people believe they can multitask in that way. And obviously we've talked a bit about the emotional side, and potentially those phone conversations might be emotive, they might be triggering different parts of the brain. So I think my question, Lisa, is what's going on there? So when someone picks up their phone, what's the stuff that's happening?
Okay. So there are basically three different sources of distraction: visual, manual, and cognitive. So with a handheld mobile phone, you've got the manual distraction, the fact that you're having to take your hand off the wheel and, move your hand to another, part of the cab. So that source of distraction is a danger. And then you've got the visual distraction, which is where your eyes are off the road. So, of course, then you can't detect hazards so easily. And then you have the cognitive distraction, which is around the phone call and having to think through the responses that you need to give when people are asking you questions or saying something about perhaps your delivery or whatever. And then, of course, if there's an emotional context here where your manager is saying, well, where are you? You know, the customer's been ringing up, you're running late, you know, what's going on? You know, then there's an emotional aspect to the distraction. So using your mobile phone can actually be a source of distraction in many different types of ways. And we do know that when you're using your phone, whether it's hands-free or handheld, you are 4 times more likely to crash. So it's a major problem.
Yeah, fantastic. And it is fascinating because it increasingly, you know, when I'm out on the roads, you see people distracted you can see people distracted on their phones, and increasingly it feels that as the younger generation, and I'm not blaming fully the younger generation, because there's plenty of older people who are addicted to their phones and struggle to put them down, but ultimately it's like an extension of their selves, particularly with people who've grown up with them, that it's going to be a real challenge, I think, potentially a real challenge for us. So I'm going to draw back though, because that's really interesting for the listeners to think about those 3 core areas: visual distractions, manual distractions, and cognitive distractions. So that's a really, really good 3 areas for them to get a handle on, because naturally I think there's this tendency when we talk about distracted driving that we think about mobile phones and almost those manual distractions, like, because when we first spoke I was sort of along that mind track around, you know, the buttons in the cab, fiddling with the sat nav, changing the radio station. I'm starting to sound old now. Changing the CD, we don't do that anymore. Changing the tape deck, there we go, that's back in the day, right? But ultimately, yeah, so visual distractions are, I know visual distractions are particularly challenging, because I've had that before, where and I've nearly had an incident. I'm always very conscious of when I have a near miss, and I realized that I've not seen it. I've not seen that potential hazard, and it will have been because I was looking at something else. I was distracted. So yeah, are we able to put a bit more maybe explanation around those sort of 3 areas, if that's okay for listeners, please, Lisa?
Hello, it's Shani from Flagship Partners. We are really proud to sponsor the Fleet Geeks podcast. If you need expert advice or training for your fleet business, make Flagship Partners your first choice. We are really excited to announce the launch of our Transport Manager Academy. With expert development for fleet leaders, we offer fully accredited initial Transport Manager CPC training, CPC refresher, and operator license awareness training, as well as mentoring, support, and professional development beyond the qualification. Our vision is to develop elite fleet professionals.
So what's a visual distraction? What could a visual distraction be that will prevent hazard perception?
Okay, so a visual distraction is anything that takes your eyes off the road for more than 2 seconds.
Right.
If it's beyond 2 seconds, then it wouldn't actually be classed as a distraction. It would be classed as inattention, which is a particular problem for automated vehicles, where we're going to see more and more that people will be expecting the vehicle to take control of the task and completely inattend, if you like, to what's going on around them. So distraction is where you're a couple of seconds away, and even for those 2-second glances, you know, you're seeing an increase in risk beyond those 2 seconds. So you can imagine, if you're driving at speed, a lot is happening in milliseconds, and taking your eyes off the road is a potential source of risk. You know, even when you think about how we use our eyes, we are not able to see anything during a scan path, that is from one fixation to another. Everything is blurred in that scan path, and it's only when you fixate that you're able to actually process the information through the brain, if you like, to be able to transfer that information into the frontal lobe, and therefore make an appropriate response. So, you know, we also are vulnerable to change blindness visually, so that if we're not fixated at regular intervals, it was kind of like taking a snapshot when we're looking around, when we're driving, and if there's a wide scan path and there's a small image in that scan path, let's say a motorcyclist, and you're going from one fixation to another, and that motorcyclist is in your scan path, you simply won't see them. They will actually disappear. So, this is why it's so important to keep your eyes on the road and make sure that you process the key priority hazards.
Yeah, sure. And I see that myself, where I've been driving at night and I kind of become dazed by the red lights, the sort of tail lights of everything I'm following. And that there's almost like, I don't know, you team that with a bit of tiredness, and all of a sudden it's almost enough to really sort of start to affect you visually, because all you're seeing is just these red lights and darkness, and it's very hard to start to judge space and those kinds of things. I'm sure people will understand those. So moving on then to a manual distraction. So that's something that somebody picks up kinesthetically, they're touching, they're doing something with. Is that the right explanation of a manual distraction?
Yeah, that's right. So reaching, for paperwork, perhaps things that fall in the footwell of the passenger seat, eating, drinking, taking your hands off the wheel, essentially. And, there are some absolutely horrific cases where people have been driving using the knees and, sort of really not in control at all of their vehicle. So those kinds of manual distractions are also a key source of risk.
Yeah. And then finally, cognitive, I'm supposing, is anything that's making our brain work. So emotional, conversational, any of those kinds of things. So in your opinion, I don't know if I'm sort of setting you up here with the question, so hopefully I'm not, but in your opinion, so one of the challenges that many operators have is the way of communicating with their drivers. So when they're driving, calling them. What's your thoughts on that? Because some companies I know are starting to try and reduce that as much as possible, even to the point of not speaking to drivers when they're driving. But I know there's many that will continue to do so, because operationally that's something they feel is necessary to do. What's your thoughts on that, I suppose, is the question, really.
The evidence around safety culture is that those companies that operate in a safer manner and therefore are statistically less likely to have crashes do not communicate with their drivers whilst they're driving. So I would really encourage anyone listening to ensure that they set their operations up in such a way that they don't need to communicate, that perhaps if they have telematics, they can see where the vehicle is, they can see, what progress is being made, and find an opportunity when they've pulled over to talk to them, but when it's safe to do so.
Really, really good information, Lisa. Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question about semi-autonomous vehicles in a moment, because that's really interesting, and that piqued my interest when you mentioned that, and I just picked up on that. But before I do that, does the studies show any other recommendations with regards to distractions that potentially might be good takeaways for the managers listening?
There are some interventions that I found in the research to evidence how you can help people to overcome distractions, because we know there are particular locations on the roads that are very dangerous, where people tend to are more likely to get distracted than other areas, like, for example, at junctions, because the perception is that they're slowing down, they're going to come to a stop. This is a time to sort of reach for the phone or reach for something. Or think about something else because the kind of demand has reduced. But actually, junctions are one of the most riskiest locations available, because essentially you've got a lot for the brain to do at that time. You're having to think about, when to emerge, whether the gap is sufficient, the speed of oncoming vehicles. You have to really be on your game when you're emerging from a junction, especially with a large vehicle. So that's, some of the distraction training aspects that I've found in the evidence suggests that, there are key ways that you can increase people's knowledge and awareness of why people are more likely to be distracted, what kind of situations they're likely to be, and what they can do to overcome those distractions.
That's really interesting. There's been so many takeaways hidden within these 3 podcasts for fleet managers, loads of really good stuff. And I'm just thinking about some of them. That's one of them, the hazard perception, the ongoing hazard perception training that we were talking about, the sort of watching another expert driving and them talking about the hazards they experience. So many fantastic takeaways. So thank you, Lisa. It piqued my interest. So we're moving towards autonomous, semi-autonomous vehicles, and interestingly, you've pointed out that presents a distraction challenge, because anything longer than 2 seconds is no longer a distraction. It's a what? Sorry, it's a
inattention.
Inattention.
Yeah.
So naturally, a semi-autonomous vehicle is going to create inattention because the vehicle's doing the work. So just humour me for a moment, and is that something that you're starting to think about yet? I'm sure there's not any studies, but I'm sure it's something you're looking to try and get your teeth into sort of in the near future as this is going to become a challenge, because ultimately fully autonomous we're miles away from. So there's going to be this hybrid period where it's almost going to get, I don't know, where we anticipate it becoming more autonomous, but actually potentially does that pose more of a risk from a human factors point of view? Because the driver, at what point does the driver intervene with the vehicle? It almost creates a whole new challenge set, I suppose. Is my brain heading in the right direction with this?
Yes, it is. And you'll be pleased to hear I've been working on this topic for about 3 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
With a huge contract at Cranfield, looking at the problem of autonomous vehicles, especially with regards to behavioural adaptation. And there are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of studies published now on this topic. So I've been getting to grips with this field because obviously it's a major traffic safety problem that is just around the corner. And you'll have seen in the US there's been all sorts of issues with Tesla and Cruise and so on. And you're right, we're a long way off fully autonomous vehicles being something that the general public can buy. But what we do have on our roads right now are what's called automated vehicles, or you refer to them as semi-autonomous. And there's a lot of confusion around terminology here, but automated vehicles are those that will take over part of the driving task, like, for example, speed control and increasingly lane keeping. So we're starting to see in the next year or so what's called level 3 vehicles that not only maintain and control speed, but they also change lanes. Now, that represents a significant change in the role of the driver in the coming years. And really, they can go to a showroom now and buy a level 2 vehicle, which is a Tesla with the autopilot function, let's say. There are other vehicles as well. And they can actually operate autopilot on our motorways. So there's a danger now where people have the impression that they don't need to observe what's going on around them, that the vehicle is making all the decisions. But unfortunately, the vehicle isn't, the software isn't fully developed yet. So there are going to be occasions when the vehicle is going to ask the driver to take back control. And this is the major source of research in this field, where the people that I work with are particularly concerned about whether or not the driver is prepared to take back control. Because if you imagine they've spent the last 20 minutes or so thinking about something else, perhaps looking at playing games on their phone. They shouldn't do that, because in the manual it clearly says that they should be attending at all times. But we know that humans don't do what they should do. And the danger is that people are not going to be situationally aware enough to be able to take back control safely.
Yeah. See, I find that really fascinating. It started to link over, so it really, really interesting. So thanks for humouring me, and I'm really pleased that's something you're working on. I think that's something potentially maybe in a few months' time we'll maybe have another conversation about it at that point. But I think it's absolutely fascinating, and that point you make, it really aligns with I and that's very random, but I train a time management course where we look at different elements of time management, and one of the rules that I train is around, if someone allows themselves to be distracted from a task, and I don't necessarily mean driving, but this distraction from a task, and I mean properly distracted for a period of time. So, they pick up their phone, they're in the middle of doing something, writing an essay, they check Facebook, they start doing some bits there and then come back. Studies show 15 minutes potentially before the full focus is back on the task at hand, 20 minutes, which is a major distraction. And potentially, if we're looking at applying that same principle, I'm not sure the numbers would be the same, I'm sure, but the principle ultimately is the same, in that you've almost, or there's the risk almost that people behind a wheel will just shut down from the task at hand, and have to all of a sudden retake back control.
Yes, and you've got most vehicles will give you a 10-second countdown. Right. So you've only got 10 seconds, and yet, as you quite rightly point out, the brain is preoccupied. It's thinking about the last game it played, or something else, and they're just not prepared. And some of the studies in this field, we've done at Cranfield some Tesla studies on the motorways, and looked at how people's adapt their preferred distance to the vehicle in front with experience. And what we're looking at here is that some people take 40 seconds to be able to take back control in a way that is manageable, reasonably safe. So yeah, I'm afraid a lot of people in my field are very concerned about what's going on.
40 seconds at 60 miles an hour is nearly 3/4 of a mile.
Exactly.
Which is an awful long distance of potential stuff to happen. It's quite frightening. Lisa, that's been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast as well. And thank you for taking the time out to share your expertise and your experience and the findings from your survey as well. Listeners, on each of the 3 episodes, I've tagged Lisa's company SciDrive in on the show notes. So please do go and check SciDrive out. Get in touch with Lisa on LinkedIn, that sort of stuff, if you're interested in any further elements of some of the services that she may be able to support with. Lisa, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
I do. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Pete.
Cool. It's been a pleasure. And if anyone's got any questions or wants to fire anything over that's come out of the podcast I've done with Lisa, please do drop us a line, and look forward to speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining me, Lisa. Appreciate it. I'm just going to stop the recording now. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share with your friends and colleagues too. Join us for free on Facebook with the Fleet Geeks community for transport and fleet managers. Fleet Geeks offers ongoing professional development, networking and mentoring too. So get in touch with me, Pete Rushmer, on any social media platform to find out more.